Mr. Todd was on his way to Alaska to look for gold, and he stopped off in Weiser, Idaho to visit a friend, Mr. Fuller. And Mr. Fuller said, you know, they're selling state land down around Nampa, and what you might be interested in doing is looking at that proposition. So Mr. Todd looked around, took his $2,000 and bought 160 acres at Roxburgh, the railroad siding on the B&O Railroad that ran from Nampa to Murphy. So now today, when you go down the hill on your way on Southside Boulevard on your way to Melba, the first thing you'll see is a sign that says, "Welcome to Melba, Seed Heart of America." And when you go on down the hill, you see the beautiful green fields in the background. The first building that you see around the corner is the old Legion Hall. It's an empty building now, but it's been a restaurant and probably will be soon. The next building is Vance Levitt's welding shop. This has been a garage and a restaurant and several things, but Vance was in business here probably for 20 years or more. In the early days, Charlie Black was the manager of the Gem State Lumber Company, but I'm not sure where that's located. It's on that corner somewhere. So then in 1972, I decided to do a little history of Melba, and I came on a Sunday morning when nobody was in town, and I took slide pictures of all the buildings in town. So this is the Jay's place, and you'll see in the background the co-op building. The co-op building was several things. It was a machine shop when Art Montgomery and Tex Smith had it. Shorty Robinson had a tire shop there. Cummins had a drugstore. And in the fall, when the farmers were finished, they'd have a harvest festival. So there's the display from Glendale School, and there would be a display from Melmont and a display from Melba. There's Melmont display. And they'd bring all their produce and everything and show that. And there's another shot of that. It says Melba Service up on the side of it. This was in 1972, so that's 40 years ago. And when I show these slides to the school kids, they think this is really the old days. And those buildings have changed now. So Cook's Tool Hole was where that second building was. Across the street was Webb's garage. He was the first one to build a garage here. Then it was sold to Bernard, traded to him for some property in Wylie County, and it was Bernard's garage for years. Some people will remember it as Munt's garage. On down the street is Mr. Pettyjohn's post office. He became postmaster in about 1924, and he built his own little building, and you can see the door and the first two windows. That was where the post office was. And then another building was built next to it that was a restaurant, and then eventually they put the two together, and that was a barber shop for a while and a restaurant. This is the Mrs. Todd's post office. After Mr. Pettyjohn was postmaster for 12 years, then 1932 election, the Democrats took charge and they appointed a postmaster instead of applying for the job, and it became civil service, and Mrs. Todd became the postmaster, and she was there for 20 years in this building, and she lived in the back. This was originally Mr. Eichenberger's home. The next building down the street from the co-op building was Ed Webb's drugstore. Originally, when he came to town, he lived in the back of the co-op building and took over Mr. Cummins' drugstore, and he was there 3 or 4 years. And then he built this drugstore and moved into it on December 7th, 1941. The next building was the very first store that was ever built. It was Conyers little store built in 1913. And then McLean from Nampa came in a few years and built this big, nice brick building in front. It was called McLean's Hardware for a long time. Then it was sold, and it sat empty for 20 years. And then Bob Price came along and purchased it and remodeled it and made Broadway Market. And that's what that was a few years ago. When you go on down the street on the other side, on the east side of Broadway, there's the Melba Feed and Fuel, and that's Francis and Ernie Smith, and they had that for several years. But first of all, Ben Gardner built it for a pool hall, and Mr. Eichenberger bought it, and he had the Melba Feed and Fuel. This is the way the feed store looked in the old days. You could go in there and buy potatoes or whatever by the pound, and all that equipment for raising chickens and eggs and so forth. That was Bob Hartzell and Carl Bazell. Carl Bazell was part owner with Ernie Smith for a long time. And across the street from that was the depot. And you can see where it should have been. There still sits the track, but it's been taken up about 10 years ago. This was Westbrook's Bar, and it was Buck's for a long, long time. It was really called the Palace Bar, but everybody called it Buck's. And now, once again, Buck's nephew has purchased that and remodeled it, and it's called Buck's. This is the way it looked downtown in the 1920s. Instead of having farm sales out in their locale, they brought everything into town. They'd set up pens and bring calves and things, and so it was pretty going concern in those days. This is another view of the Melba Feed and Fuel after they built an elevator, and then it's closed now. And there's Amos's Melba Service, and it has been Bill Selby's garage, and it's been Beal's garage. It burnt when it was Beal's garage, and then it was rebuilt. So Joe Amos had that for years, and then his son J.L. Amos had it for a long time, and it's closed. This is Joe Amos. This is the Melba High School. It was up on Randolph, east of the red building, and it fronts right on Randolph. There's going down Randolph. This is the way the Baptist church looked several years ago. It's actually the first church built in Melba in 1920. And this guy's called a colporteur. He traveled around, and instead of having a permanent preacher, they traveled and preached at different churches. This is the French church before it burned and was remodeled. And this is the LDS church, the first one they built after they had their little building uptown, which I'll show you. This is the City Hall, but it was first a fire station. You can see the door for one truck, and there, before they remodeled that had doors for two trucks. But now it's totally City Hall. This is the old Melba Grade School, and in 1915, the governor came and helped the kids plant trees in front of it. And that was a really big deal. That was Arbor Day. And so here's one of the trees that's left today. And it is now the American Legion building. And this is the theater, and it is now the Walters Butte Grange, and it was built right after World War II. There was quite a building boom in those days. And so that was the Tower Theater. And this is the Oddfellow Hall. And Mrs. Gardner and her daughter, Iva Sturm, built this in 1919. And the people who stayed there were the guys who were working on the ditches and building the roads and so forth. So they had a dining room down in and the kitchen down in the first floor, and then they had rooms up overhead. And they were so busy in those years that you can see where they've added on to the back and made 15 more rooms. And this is the first LDS church, and it was built about 1924, I think. And Mr. Bramstead bought. It was built for a dance hall. Mr. Bramstead bought it and made a church, and they had the church there for about 20 years, and it was used for public things like graduations and so forth, because there was not another building that big in town at the time. Here's three old farmers, Tad Zire on the right, Al Barr in the center, and Bird Holly on the left. And this is Atwell Perry. He bought, the store was built by Caddy for Caddy's Market, and then he sold it to Atwell Perry or somebody else, and then Atwell Perry bought it anyway in about 1962 or 3. And then he later became a senator, but he had a very good market. This is Clover Farm Market. It was Caddy's in 1950. After the war, Lloyd Coleman came home and built this, and it was called Lloyd's Garage. He had worked at Bernard's Garage and Joe Amos's before the war. And next to it was Lloyd Swarthout's gun shop and Westinghouse store. You could go in there and buy new appliances and everything. And beside it, it was Mary Kimmery built the variety store, and it is now Shelley's antique store. Across the street is Mrs. Hurst's house, and note that it's just sitting on rocks. And that house is still there with the little wrought iron fence around it, but it's probably almost the oldest house in Melba. And this on down the street, or across the street from Mrs. Hurst's house, is a lumber yard, and that was Boise Piatt Lumber Company. And they were really going concern right after World War I, because everybody built their houses then, and the churches and everything. Later on, Cecil Wood bought it, and he ran it for many years. And back on the east side of Kerry Rex is the old beauty shop, and it was a beauty shop for 35 years, but Dr. Swain, I think, built this house, and anyway, he lived there 4 years. But he said everybody drove by and went to Nampa to the doctor, and then when he moved to Nampa to be a doctor, well, then everybody from Melba went to him then. There's Mrs. Todd and Mrs. Grover. Mrs. Rose Grover lived down below Melba by the railroad track. This is the Gem State Lumber Company, and there were 2 or 3 lumber companies at the time. This is, once again, sale day downtown Melba in the early 20s. And you can see the buildings in the background, the Lodge Hall and the little LDS church. And this is the workers building the Gardner Hotel. It must have been quite an edifice in those days. And another shot of downtown Melba. So everybody brought their cars and whatever, and met in the middle of the street. It looks like there's Todd's on the right and the McLean Hardware on the left, and you can see the post office in the back. And this is B.M. Hawley's real estate office, and I think it's on the corner of Broadway and 4th Street, which is school property. And this is the water tower. It's probably about the second or third one. This is the reclamation barn, and when they were working on the ditches and the roads, this is where they kept their horses, and this is right where the city park is right now, where the library is. I think the building at the left is the house that is behind the library. And anyway, this is right there on that corner. And then we have some farmer pictures, and this is Halverson's haying, and this is Doc Heisem in the front helping them out. Must have been much younger. This is a view of the cemetery, and it's a prettiest cemetery around these days. This is how they were doing potatoes in about 1980. There's the potato sorting shed, which was in operation all before the war and through the war. And they brought the potatoes into the railroad with wagons. And this is Eddie Cram working on the threshing machine. That was just machine operated. It wasn't electrified or anything like that. And this is a beet dump at Beaumont. And there's a Mormon derrick, which everyone put up their hay with the derrick. And we go on down, and this is the front of the Glendale School, and it shows the bell tower, and now that bell is in the football field, and it has a nice little plaque beside it that shows that it is the Glendale Bell. And right after World War II, when the farmers were really organized and the labor camp, this just shows that the railroad went through Melba. You can see the tracks, and there's our little sign, and there's nothing there to show at all now. The tracks were taken up about 10 years ago. And there's another shot of the tracks. It's kind of changed history when they took the tracks up. And this is when they built the steel bridge down at the river. This is 1922, I think. Mr. Parsons Albert Parsons has all those horses, and they're just finishing the approach to the steel car bridge. And then in the early 70s, they built that new car bridge over there, and the steel bridge is still there. And then there's the Geffey Bridge, which is the railroad bridge. And that's a mark for this area. It's still there, and it's always been there. It's been significant. There's another shot of that. And this is a Simplot Soil Builders. They had a great big operation out on the corner of Melmont and Track Road where the Melmont School sat. And now it's gone, and there's just a fenced-in track of weeds with no mention of Simplots or Melmont or anything. When you're going down toward the river where the train tracks were, Dewey, who built the Dewey Palace Hotel, had also built the railroad, and I heard that he took a flatbed car and hauled rocks from this area. It's just down there by the feedlot before you start on down toward the river. And he used those rocks for the foundation for the Dewey Palace Hotel. If it isn't true, it's a good story. And the last thing we see when we come down to Melba, we can go to the cemetery or anywhere, we'll see the Walters Butte. And it is the symbol of the school annual, and the Walters Butte Grange used that symbol, and it is a significant mark for our town and our valley. Thank you very much.